Good evening. I'm Dr. Bob Uzzle, instructor in political science at Cedar Valley College. Um, this is a lecture on public opinion and political socialization for my class in federal government at Cedar Valley. Hope everybody had a nice Easter weekend in spite of the fact that we've had to adapt to less desirable circumstances during the coming pandemic. Public opinion is defined as what the public thinks about a particular issue um, or set of issues any point in time. Does public opinion stay the same all the time? It does not. It changes continuously. In fact, you might say it changes as often as the wind blows. Public opinion polls are interviews or surveys with samples of citizens that are used to estimate the feelings and beliefs of the entire population. Probably the most famous of the political polls is that created by George Gallup, one of the earliest developers of scientific methods of public opinion polling, a proponent for a strong role for the voice of the public in politics and in government. You know, every time there's a presidential election and many other elections, you find polls out there to determine how the election's going to go. And some of the polls are pretty accurate, some are not. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. Straw polls are unscientific survey used to gauge public opinion on a variety of issues and policies. A sample is a subset of the whole population selected to be questioned on the purposes of prediction or gauging public opinion. On page 224 of our textbook, it has this famous picture right here of President Harry S. Truman holding up a copy of the Chicago Daily Tribune, which was a Republican newspaper. This was in the election of 1948. New York Governor Thomas Dewey was the Republican nominee running against Truman. And the Republicans had gained control of both houses of Congress during the midterm elections of 1946. And, so they were out to get these elections. They thought that they had it in the bag. Truman got on the train and traveled around the country giving speeches, blasting the new do-nothing Republican congressman. And again, they quit polling like a week or so before the election, and they had it all mapped out how it was going to go. There was even some discussion about what possibly might happen during the coming Dewey administration. But there was nothing to it. Truman won. And it is, and so that's the classic case of them getting it wrong. And it's been a number of times since 1948 when a candidate who was running behind in the polls, that's called an underdog, will cite the election of 1948 as an example of how things didn't turn out. And so we're going to pull from behind, just like Harry Truman did. Push polls are polls taken for the purpose of providing information on an opponent that would lead respondents to vote against that candidate. And so a population is the entire group of people whose attitudes a researcher wants to measure. Now, Obviously, if the population you're talking about is the entire population of the United States, the entire population of Texas, or even the entire population of a city, it might be difficult to uh, interview all of them. So you got to decide on who you're going to interview. Random sampling is a method of poll selection that gives each person in the group the same chance of being selected. Stratified sampling, a variation of random sampling, the population is divided into subgroups and weighted based on demographic characteristics of the national population. And polls have been around for a long time. A lot of studies have been done about different characteristics. You may want to sample uh, only males. You may want to sample only females. You may want to sample only members of particular ethnic groups, only people with particular incomes within certain ranges. So it's depends on what kind of data you're looking for. Decades ago, there was a couple, Robert and Helen Lind, who went and to a town of Muncie, Indiana. They spent a good while there. This just wasn't for an election. This was a sociological study of the community. They produced a book called Middletown, USA. They described what went on in there, the various types of institutions, the churches, the lodges, the clubs, the schools, the businesses, the politics, and many other things. That and Middletown being Muncie being the typical American community. Fascinating study. And 10 years later, they came back and did the same thing, and that town has been researched repeatedly over the years. The question what would be, is it what you find there reflective on what you find in the rest of the country? How typical is any one community? Well, that's very hard to say. And but some of these polls can give indication on who's going to vote and how they're going to vote. Tracking polls or continuous surveys enable a campaign or news organizations to chart a candidate's daily or weekly rise or fall in support. Exit polls are polls conducted as voters leave the selected polling places on election day. Now, when people are coming out, who'd you vote for? Why'd you vote for them? What was the significance? What were the issues involved? And how honest the people are going to be is questionable. And uh, it's been important for, and sometimes people would point this out about the news media, refraining from making predictions too early. For example, the West Coast is 2 hours earlier than it is here in Texas because we're in Central Standard Time. Eastern Standard Time is an hour later than us. Get to Colorado, you've got Mountain Standard Time. Actually, a small portion of Texas out around El Paso is in the Mountain Standard Time zone. But then California, Oregon, and Washington, Pacific Standard Time. But if you're in line to vote and the networks have already called the results, candidate X is won, are you going to still vote for candidate Y? All that's got to be taken into consideration. The margin of error is a measure of the accuracy of a public opinion poll within statistical parameters. No poll claims to be 100% accurate. None claim to be airtight. But there can be within so many points as your margin of error. So they try to make them as accurate as possible. A sampling error is errors resulting from the size or the quality of the survey sample. If you want to know how people in a particular geographic area feel about a particular issue, well, you might get that some results there. It may or may not reflect people in other geographical issues when you start taking into demographic considerations such as age, gender, ethnicity, religious faith, occupation, ideology, etc. A political ideology, by the way, is a coherent set of values and beliefs about the purposes and scope of government held by groups or individuals. Now, it is a fact that there is a group of people known as anarchists who are opposed to government in any form. And but that's only a small group of people. They've never had a large following for obvious reasons. Americans can argue all day long about what the government should do, what the government should not do, how much government we need, how it's to be financed. But very few people would argue that government's not needed. Most people would agree that some government is needed. Absolutely. A conservative is one who favors limited government intervention, particularly in economic matters. You can keep this in mind that a conservative wants less government control of the economy, but they want more control of social behavior. On the other hand, a liberal wants more control of the economy, less control of social behavior. A libertarian wants less control of both. A communitarian wants more control of both. A social conservative is one who believes the government should support further traditional moral teachings. The late Barry Goldwater was long-term U.S. Senator from Arizona. He was a conservative icon. And I never will forget when in the 1980s, when the moral majority came around and they started talking about combining traditional Republican politics with with fundamentalist Protestant Christianity. Goldwater protested, saying this has nothing to do with conservatism. He was very conservative on economics. He favored free enterprise and limited government. He was very hawkish in his views of the military. But at the same time, Goldwater was pro-choice on abortion. He's also supported gay rights, which was unusual, especially in that day for a conservative. He said to be in the military, you don't have to be straight, you just need to be able to shoot straight. So not all conservatives are social conservatives. A moderate is a person who takes a relatively centrist position or middle of the road view on most political issues. And political socialization is the process through which individuals acquire their political beliefs and values. That starts from the time you're born. Your socialization begins. In fact, as I've heard that a child learns more in their first 5 years than they do in any time during their life. And it continues. You're socialized about politics, about religion, about economics, about family values, all kinds of things. And it's a step-by-step process. And but this is how one learns one's values, socialization. And there's different agents of socialization. Certainly the family is the most basic level of all. If you go to school, your school is certainly an agent of socialization. If you're a member of a church or synagogue or mosque or whatever, those religious influences are going to have an impact on you. And your peer group, people you go to school with, people you hang out with, people you associate with, they're going to have an influence as well. And someone made a statement one time, and I thoroughly agree with this. You need to take the best values from each group. I agree with that 100%. But I realize trying to find the best from each, not everybody's going to agree on what is the best, what is to be avoided. The mass media is another influence. It's become more and more the case now. In the past, it was newspapers and magazines, still is to some extent. Then you have radio and television, movies, and of course the all-powerful internet. And so this leads to political knowledge, and you get cues from leaders or opinion makers. Political knowledge and political participation have a reciprocal effect on one another. An increase in one will increase the other. Knowledge about the political system is essential to successful political involvement, which in turn teaches citizens about politics and expands their interest in public affairs. Although few citizens know anything about all the candidates and issues in a particular election, they can and often do know enough to impose their views and values on the general direction a nation should take. And some people are more in tune with politics than others. Some people take active parts in politics, and they not only vote, but they write letters to persons in office. They participate in campaigns, passing out literature, making phone calls, knocking doors, doing all kinds of stuff to get people to vote for whoever they want to vote for. But there's many other people who could care less about politics. I'd say most people fall somewhere in between. They vote and have opinions about things, but they don't get really overly involved in politics. And it's important to some and not important to others. But it's been said that the most Americans' level of knowledge about history and politics is quite low. According to the U.S. Department of Education, today's college graduates have less civic knowledge than high school graduates did 50 years ago. Americans also do not appear to know much about foreign policy. Some critics even argue that many Americans are geographically illiterate. Where is a particular country? The only thing about it, their history, their politics. Gender differences are significant. Women lag behind their male counterparts in many traditional measures of political knowledge. However, on issues important to women, um, such as representation in the legislature, women do as well or better than men do. The gender gap also appears to be affected by education, age, number of children, and marital status. And education can affect a lot of things. It's studies have shown, for example, that high school seniors tend to be more liberal in their politics than high school freshmen because um, I'm sorry. Look, scratch what I just said. Uh, that's not true. I was saying high school. I'm talking about college. College seniors tend to be more liberal in their politics than college freshmen. The reason for that is very simple. During 4 years of college, one is exposed to different ideas, many of which they were not raised with. They see a much bigger world out there. And so their views on different issues move beyond the provincial. And they tend to be much more liberal at the time they graduate than when they started college. That's not true in every case. There's depends on where you went to college and what you majored in. Sociology majors are more liberal than business majors for the most part. But after a person graduates, they pursue a career, they raise a family, they pay taxes, they do tend to become more conservative. But this is some thoughts about public opinion and political socialization.